Welcome to the CDA Institute's Expert Series, the podcast that brings you in-depth conversations with the brightest minds in defense, security, foreign policy, and international relations. Each week, we delve into the most pressing issues facing our world today. Our esteemed guests from academia, industry, military, and government backgrounds offer unique insights and analysis that you won't find anywhere else. Get ready to expand your knowledge and engage in thought-provoking discussion with us. David Johnston, independent special rapporteur on foreign interference, decided against holding a public inquiry into electoral interference. Johnston has suggested conducting public hearings instead. Opposition party leaders, some media outlets, and experts have expressed dismay and continue to insist on the need for a public inquiry. Joining us today to discuss the implications of these hearings, we have Wesley Wark, Senior Fellow at the Center for International Governance Innovation. This is the Expert Series. Wesley, thanks for accepting our invitation. Great to have you on the program today. Let's dive right in, shall we? In a discussion the CDA Institute had with Thomas Chenot, he expressed skepticism about the added value of holding an inquiry, especially considering the ongoing activities of NSICOP, a number of parliamentary committees, and other mechanisms. What do you think about the decision not to hold an inquiry? And given what some see as at least a perception of conflict of interest, was Johnston the right individual to lead the investigation into foreign interference?
I think, first of all, I think many people, including myself, were surprised that David Johnston decided not to call a public inquiry. That would have been the easiest and certainly the most expected outcome from his first report. I think the reasons that he gave for deciding instead on a different path, which are a series of public hearings that he wants to hold as the next phase of his mandate, to inform a report that he has to produce by the end of October. I think the reasons that he provided for that are ones that really resonate with me. And I think as people come to sort of think about this whole issue a bit more calmly, which perhaps hasn't happened yet, given that there were a lot of dug-in positions before Mr. Johnston produced his report, I think as people, as I say, come to think about this a bit more calmly, the question of the value of public hearings needs to be considered in the context of what the intended outcomes are. And from my perspective, one of the most important outcomes of public hearings, which aren't usually captured in judicial inquiries, is that you can really open up questions and hear from a diversity of points of view in public hearings, particularly if the idea is it's important to try and ensure that Canadians, the Canadian public at large, better understands national security threats and better understands the work and challenges of the intelligence community. I think there's a lot of room and a lot of opportunity presented by public inquiries to raise the level of what the CIGI director has called the problem of national security illiteracy in Canada. And I think that is a serious problem. And I think many of the discussions around Mr. Johnston's first report reflect that serious problem, that people don't really understand how national security and intelligence works. And it shouldn't be an area left simply for government insiders in the security and intelligence community or for a handful of outside experts to debate in. Now, like I have taken part in 3 judicial inquiries over the past 20 years, Justice O'Connor's inquiry into the Aurora affair, Justice Major's inquiry into Air India, and most recently, the Public Order Emergency Commission that looked at the Freedom Convoy protests held by Justice Rouleau. And in all of those cases, I think it remains open to question, actually, what did they achieve? But more importantly, it remains open to question of, how much did they really advance public understanding about national security issues? So that has led me to a conclusion, even before David Johnston produced his first report, that I wasn't convinced that a judicial inquiry, and let's call it that, was a way forward if transparency was really the objective, and if improving the Canadian public's understanding of national security and intelligence, which I think is an important objective, is also in mind. It has to be said as well, and I think this has been a practical point overlooked in much of the public discussion so far, that judicial inquiries take time. They operate in a certain judicial framework, of course, but they take time. The Arar inquiry took 2.5 years. Justice Major's Air India inquiry, I think, over 3 years. Justice Rouleau's inquiry a bit different because its framework was already set out in the Emergencies Act. But even there, as people will recall, Justice Rouleau complained on many occasions about the difficult timelines he faced. So if we're wanting to achieve greater degrees of public transparency, as well as, of course, practical recommendations, and if we're wanting to move at some speed, and if people really are convinced, as they say they are, that this is an urgent matter, then from my perspective, public hearings, we'll have to see about the substance and what comes out of them, but public hearings, frankly, offer a much better opportunity to achieve those two objectives than do judicial inquiries. So that's why I was leaning in the direction of not holding a public inquiry. I didn't guess that Mr. Johnston would say, here's an alternative, public hearings. But now that he's pronounced on that, I'm hopeful that they'll really achieve some outcomes that would be unlikely to be achieved in a judicial inquiry.
Do you think that there's any potential risk of losing focus on the escalating threat of foreign interference due to side battles over public inquiry versus public hearings and criticism of David Johnston's role as special rapporteur?
No, it's all part of the political theater, I suppose, particularly being played out in Parliament. I think the reality is that people have come to learn through leaked intelligence and media reports that foreign interference is a problem, and it is likely to be an escalating problem. As Mr. Johnston has said, it's not a problem that's going to go away. There are better ways to understand that problem than through, selective leaks reported on by the media, I think. And so the more eyes we have on this problem, whether it's independent reporting from the National Security Intelligence Review Agency or independent reporting from the National Security Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians, or Mr. Johnston's report, I think the more eyes, the more reports, frankly, the better. So out of all of that mix of reporting, I think rather than losing sight of the issue, I think we're going to get a lot more attention to it. In an ideal world, we wouldn't have needed this plethora of reports. But as the Prime Minister said, and I think he was right on this in March 6th, so it's a kind of astounding thing to say, he in asking the two independent review bodies to look at this question, he wasn't sure that the public would fully accept their work. And so he said, well, to try and take it out of the partisan atmosphere, he would appoint an independent special rapporteur. We didn't know at that point on March 6th who that person would be. Mr. Johnston's reputation, integrity, independence has been called into question. I don't support any of that. But people are free to take whatever positions they like on Mr. Johnston. What I would say about that is that I think people should read his first report as opposed to simply commenting on it. And I would challenge people who actually read the report and think about it to say, well, this isn't an independent report. It's a whitewash, or whatever they want to say. The reality is that the report in many places is quite critical of the current handling of threat reporting on foreign interference, the machinery of government problems that he's identified. So it doesn't strike me as a whitewash in any sense. And so I guess my message to Canadians would be, read the report, give the public hearings a chance. And at the end of the day, if you're not satisfied by the public hearings, fair enough. If you're not satisfied by the recommendations that Mr. Johnston comes up with in October, fair enough. But at least we'll have had the opportunity to have what I hope would be actually an unprecedented public debate. And the last thing I would just say about that is Canadians can ask themselves, well, when was the last time that we had a public debate about the conduct of intelligence in Canada? Well, the reality is never. Maybe you could go back to the MacDonald Commission at the end of the 1970s and say that was sort of a debate about the conduct of intelligence, but focused on one particular agency. We've really never had this kind of thing, and I think it's high time. Last piece I would just note is that we have in Canada, I think, a tendency to focus on one national security threat at a time. Post 9/11 and, for the succeeding decade plus, it was all about the terrorism threat. And governments said over and over again, of whatever political stripe, terrorism is the number one national security threat to Canada, without telling Canadians actually their whole range of other national security threats. I fear that we're in the same kind of, that we're exhibiting the same kind of tendency to focus on one threat at the expense of others. And the reality is that Canada currently faces, for all kinds of reasons, not least because of a very fractured geopolitical environment, Canada currently faces a wide range of national security threats, of which foreign interference is only one. And I think it's incumbent on both governments and the public to understand that and talk more about the diverse range of national security threats that we face, many of which probably matter more to Canadians directly in terms of how they impact on their lives than foreign interference might. So I'm not dismissing the threat of foreign interference. I'm saying it is one of many. And there are probably, to be honest, if we're honest with ourselves, some more significant and serious threats to national security that we face in that range.
Yeah, so as you mentioned, Johnson was quite critical of aspects of our intelligence and security establishments, specifically in regard to information flows. So considering this, do you have any advice on how the Canadian government can better establish structures and coordination within intelligence systems to ensure the effective flow of intelligence and attention from senior decision makers?
Yeah, it's a great question, but let me start with a slightly broader reflection. And that is that very often when issues of intelligence failure come up, not just in Canada, but among allied countries on all kinds of issues that are of concern, the inevitable tendency is to say, well, let's fix the institutional setting, the machinery of government. And I think for many Canadians is probably a turnoff. Machinery of government, what is that? Why do I care about it? I don't understand this. And I think it would be unfortunate. There is a machinery of government point that I'm coming to in a minute, but I think it would be unfortunate if we just focused on that. And it's a concern for me, certainly, in the way in which Mr. Johnston has framed some of his interim findings in the first report. So when I say machinery of government is not enough, what I really mean by that is that machinery of government is part of a problem when it comes to intelligence. But there are other issues that really I think we need to address. And generally, they're often discussed in the context of something called the intelligence cycle, not a complex concept, but widely accepted among Western intelligence services. An intelligence cycle just tries to describe the way in which intelligence has various component parts, and they're all important. So you have intelligence collection, you have analysis, you have reporting, and it is all meant to be a kind of continuous operation. In the context of the Canadian situation, I reference this because I think it's important to look at actually the quality and style of reporting of our intelligence agencies. Is it really where we need it to be? Is our analytical capacity to take the raw intelligence that we collect, both ourselves and from our allies, and kind of produce synthetic judgments about it that really try and capture the nature of the threat? Is that quality of analysis where we want it to be? Is it properly resourced? Are the ways in which we report intelligence as sophisticated as need be? And that's partly machinery, but it's also partly, if you like, the style of intelligence reporting and the manner in which it's done. And then overall, there is this overarching question, which is often referenced by experts. It sounds a bit vague and diffuse, but it's a real problem, which is what is often called the problem of intelligence culture in Canada and the federal government. And usually by that, people mean, well, we have professional intelligence agencies that do good work in the intelligence space, but is their reporting really taken seriously, really listened to? Is the question around intelligence culture is, do Canadian governments really understand the significance of intelligence? Are they really prepared to rely on it as a primary source for informing them about wise decision making? And I think many people who have either studied the system for a long time or work within it will probably tell you that there is a real intelligence culture problem that we face. And it's something that distinguishes Canada, not to our credit, compared to our allies. In other words, it's easy to say, and I think it's true to say, that Britain, the United States, Australia, even possibly New Zealand, which is not a country we necessarily want to compare ourselves with, all of those countries take, as part of decision-making, they all take intelligence more seriously, more systematically than we do in Canada. So it's all to say, machinery of government issues are important, but they're not the entire waterfront. There's a lot of other things that we need to think about if we're really going to take on board the idea that it's time to modernize and upgrade our intelligence capabilities.
What would you say the reaction to David Johnston's report on foreign interference says about the current state of Canadian politics more broadly?
What I would say about it, I mean, what does it tell us about the state of Canadian politics? Well, I think the most obvious reflection is that although there is often an expressed desire to try and move national security and intelligence issues into some kind of nonpartisan space, I don't know how realistic that ever is, to be honest. And certainly in the current environment, there is deep partisanship around, how a government should handle national security issues. And in fact, we saw that to a certain degree in the 2021 election. Well, it must be said that it's rare that national security issues really rise to the forefront in people's minds during election campaigns. But we'll see what the future might hold in that regard. Maybe publics will pay more attention, and this will have to be a more prominent part of election campaigning whenever the next election might be. But so the first part of your answer is deep partisanship, and it has been taken in some cases to extremes in terms of allegations made about the government's handling of foreign interference, including allegations that somehow the government was turning a blind eye to intelligence about foreign interference because it was benefiting from that interference. There is absolutely nothing in Mr. Johnston's report that suggests that was the case, and he's quite firm in denying it, which is, I think, useful for Canadians to hear. There's been a lot of reliance on media reporting about foreign interference based on selective leaks. And it's curious in an age of a very diffuse social media environment that people seem to be willing to sort of take that media reporting on trust, when the reality is that no media organization, there are really only two, of course, Global News and the Globe and Mail, who've had access to this leaked material. Neither of those organizations has decided to publish any of the leaked reports that they say they had viewed, whatever viewed means. So, Canadians are really in that position where they have to trust how the media packages its understanding of those selected leaks. And I don't think that's a good place for us to be. And as you know, in Mr. Johnston's report, he is quite critical of some of the media reporting on the basis of leaked documents, which he himself, of course, has seen in their entirety and has seen more of the reporting on those kinds of themes. So again, partisanship, limited access to evidence on the part of the Canadian public. And again, I think what it reveals to me is that there is a deep lack of understanding about national security threats and about the work of the intelligence community. And to be honest, I don't blame Canadians for that, and I don't necessarily blame politicians for that. There is a long-standing problem in Canada around national security transparency and access to evidence. And one of the things I hope the foreign interference furore will cause is a change in approach to national security transparency and a willingness to provide Canadians with more evidence through a declassification project if we call it that, in terms of what the government actually knows about these things on the basis of its intelligence. And both of those issues and others are, of course, raised in David Johnston's report as part of an agenda for the public hearings that he wants to hold.
Last question, Wesley. How can we address the vulnerabilities and weaknesses within our own systems that are partly responsible for allowing such interferences to take place?
So, perhaps easiest easiest one to talk about is simply the government. How can the government improve its capacities through changes, again, to how the intelligence system works, through changes to legislation, through greater transparency, through more declassification. How can it change its own approach to national security? That's one part of the puzzle. The second part of the puzzle, frankly, goes to Parliament and political parties, all of whom have a responsibility themselves to try and both understand foreign interference, be knowledgeable about it, and protect themselves from it, whether on the campaign trail or between elections. And then there is a broader role for the Canadian public and diaspora communities that might be directly affected, of course, in particular. And again, that broader role is to understand the nature of foreign interference, to understand how any threats that they might be concerned about can be communicated to the federal government for action. But also, I think a missing part of our response to date to these foreign interference allegations is a basic faith in the idea, which I think is very important, the idea that Canadians may be targeted by foreign interference, but is foreign interference really changing Canadians' minds about how they would vote, how they view various issues? I've seen very, very little evidence of that, and it suggests to me that in Canada maybe we are losing faith in the ability of Canadians to make up their own minds, in a swirling information universe, to be sure, but to make up their own minds about their positions, to mark their own X's on ballots. I just think we need to reinforce our basic confidence in ourselves as a free and democratic society, some of which I think has been unfortunately and completely unnecessarily eroded in the course of this controversy.
Well, Wesley, thanks once again for accepting my invitation. Before we close up the interview, I'm wondering if you have any final thoughts or parting words about David Johnston's report or anything else we've discussed.
Just two things, Johnston. We've covered it a bit. One is I do just encourage people not to listen to the criticisms of David Johnston's report, but to read it if they have an opportunity. It's 56 pages, but it's readable, and you can navigate your way through it to the parts that you might be interested in. So it's worth reading, is I guess the first point. Second point is that I think the idea proposed by Mr. Johnston of public hearings is unprecedented and promising. And, we can't say anything more than promising because we haven't seen how they'll go yet. I think Canadians should give it a chance. And, I would suggest, I think it's completely naive on my part, that a lot of the sort of dug-in positions, which are fast becoming rear view mirror positions on this, we must have a judicial inquiry or nothing. I think it's time for people to give that some second thought and invest some faith, which may be well-placed or misplaced. We'll have to see, in the idea of public hearings of a sort that we've never seen before.
Wesley, thanks once more for joining us. It was great having you on the program, and we look forward to continuing these discussions with you in the future. That's all for this week's episode of the CDA Institute Expert Series. To learn more about the CDA Institute, you can visit our website at cdainstitute.ca or subscribe to our newsletter. Thanks, and we hope you'll be joining us next week.